The iron gates creaked whenever the wind swept through the small town of Blackridge in the American Midwest. It wasn't a loud or constant sound, but enough to send a shiver down the spine of any resident on quiet nights. Those walls, too high for a simple private property, hid something no one could explain, and perhaps no one really wanted to find out. For decades, Holloway Mansion remained isolated from the rest of the city. Surrounded by thick fences, overgrown vegetation, and old cameras that rarely seemed to work, it was avoided even by the most curious. Children grew up hearing stories about the place. Some said it was cursed, others that people went in, but never came out. But what made it all the more disturbing wasn't the rumors, it was the silence. No official records detailed who actually lived there in recent decades. Old documents mentioned the Holloway family, the original owners of the property, but after that, everything disappeared. It was as if that house had been erased from history, even though it remained physically present, imposing its somber existence on the city. And then there were the disappearances. They didn't happen often enough to cause immediate panic, but they were regular enough to never be forgotten. Lonely people, travelers, sometimes even locals. There was always some indirect connection to the road that passed near the mansion. There was always someone who, days later, remembered seeing a light on behind the walls that same night. The local police were investigating up to a point. Reports were filed, searches were conducted, but invariably ended without answers. Holloway Mansion was only mentioned indirectly, as if even the agents avoided officially registering any suspicion related to that place. And that's exactly what caught Daniel Carter's attention. Daniel wasn't from the city, an investigative journalist specializing in neglected cases and stories that seemed to have been deliberately forgotten. He had a history of unearthing truths that many preferred to keep buried. His interest didn't come from legends, it came from patterns, and Blackridge had too many standards to be ignored. He arrived in the city on a cold morning, with an overcast sky and damp air. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first glance. Small shops, quiet streets, residents who avoided prolonged eye contact with strangers, but simply mentioning the name of the mansion was enough to notice the change. Eyes immediately shifted. Conversations were interrupted. Some simply walked away without saying a word. Others reacted with evident discomfort, as if talking about it was more dangerous than anything that might be lurking behind the walls. Daniel wrote everything down. He didn't need direct confirmation. People's behavior already spoke louder than any testimony. There was fear there, not irrational fear, but something built up over time, something sustained by real experiences. That same afternoon, he decided to approach the property. The road leading to the walls was rarely used. The asphalt was cracked from age, and vegetation was beginning to take over the sides. As he drove further, the feeling of isolation grew. The sounds of the city slowly faded, replaced by a dense, almost oppressive silence. And then he saw the iron gates, tall, rusty, but still imposing. Thick chains held the two sections firmly closed, and an old padlock looked decades old. Beyond them, only fragments of the mansion were visible. Dark windows, walls stained by time, and a structure that seemed larger than any residence should be. Daniel approached slowly. That's when something caught his attention. Marks on the floor. Footprints. Recent. He crouched down, examining them carefully. They weren't old enough to have been made days ago. Someone had been there. Recently. Perhaps that very morning. His gaze slowly traveled up towards the gates, and it was at that moment that he realized something even more unsettling. One of the cameras, positioned above the entrance, was slightly tilted directly at him. It didn't look broken. She seemed active. Daniel stared intently for a few seconds, feeling a strange sensation of being watched. It wasn't paranoia. It was instinct. Something inside him told him there was someone on the other side of those walls, observing, waiting. Without looking away, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone, snapping a quick photo of the entrance. The click echoed louder than it should have in that absolute silence. And then something happened. A metallic sound, low but unmistakable, as if something had moved on the other side of the gate. Daniel froze. His heart raced, not from immediate fear, but from anticipation. This was exactly the kind of evidence he was looking for, something concrete, something that turned rumors into real possibility. But it was also a warning. He stood up slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the entrance. No visible movement, no figure emerging, only silence returning, as if nothing had happened. Still, something had changed. Because at that moment, Daniel understood one thing with absolute clarity. Holloway Manor was not abandoned. She was never there, and for the first time in many years, someone inside knew they were being watched in return. Blackridge wasn't just a small town. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move more slowly, but where the past never truly stayed behind. The old buildings, many of them erected in the early 20th century, bore visible marks of partial abandonment, as if the town had stopped evolving at some point and decided to remain that way. Daniel realized this in the first few days. Each street held an untold story, each resident a convenient silence, but there were deeper patterns, and he began to find them where he least expected them. The municipal library was the first step. The building, discreet and rarely visited, housed archives that were seldom consulted. The librarian, a middle-aged woman named Eleanor Briggs, showed some resistance when Daniel mentioned Holloway Mansion, but she did not prevent him from accessing the old records. And it was there that the first fragments began to fit together. The Holloway family had been one of the most influential in the region. Owners of extensive lands with significant political and economic connections at the time, they were known for their reserved behavior, but never for public scandals. Up to a certain point. Records showed a sharp change around the 1940s. Frequent mentions of the family simply ceased. There was no news of deaths, property sales, or official changes. It was as if they had vanished, without leaving any formal record. But one detail caught Daniel's attention, an old newspaper clipping, partially damaged by time. The headline was almost illegible, but one sentence could still be understood. Unusual activity reported at the Holloway property during the early morning hours. The rest of the article was incomplete. That wasn't enough. But it was a start. In the following days, Daniel decided to observe the city in a different way. Instead of asking direct questions, he began to listen more. Cafes, markets, bars, places where people talked more than they understood, and that's how he met Marcus Hale. Marcus was a former city police officer, not officially retired, just suspended after an incident that was never fully clarified. He spent most of his time in a discreet bar on the outskirts of town, always sitting in the same spot, always with the same watchful gaze. Unlike the other residents, Marcus did not avoid the subject, but it didn't make things easy either. "You shouldn't mess with that," he said without looking directly at Daniel. There was no threat in the tone, only certainty. Daniel immediately realized that Marcus knew more than he let on, and more importantly, he seemed to carry the weight of that knowledge. Over time, and with some persistence, Marcus began to give up small pieces of information. Nothing straightforward, nothing complete, but enough. He revealed that years ago, during a disappearance investigation, Holloway Mansion had been officially considered a possible point of interest. A team even went to the location, but the operation was interrupted, without clear explanations. Reports disappeared, testimonies were disregarded, and shortly after, Marcus was removed from his position. "It wasn't for lack of evidence," he said, finally looking Daniel in the eye. "It was a decision made by someone higher up." That confirmed what Daniel already suspected. There was interference, but whose and why? Meanwhile, another character was beginning to gain importance in the investigation: Clara Whitmore. Clara, a local historian known for studying the city's old records, had a completely different approach from the other residents. She didn't avoid the past. She pursued it. When Daniel met her, she already knew who he was. "You went all the way to the walls, didn't you?" he asked bluntly. That caught Daniel by surprise. Clara explained that it wasn't difficult to notice when someone new started investigating the mansion. The town reacted. The behavior changed. It was like an invisible mechanism of collective defense. But unlike the others, she wasn't afraid, or at least not enough to remain silent. Clara showed Daniel records that weren't available at the public library, personal documents, old diaries, and correspondence belonging to families who lived in the city during the rise of the Holloway family. And it was there that something even more disturbing emerged. Indirect reports, people describing sounds coming from the property at night, lights that turned on and off at irregular times, and what's most unsettling, mentions of deliveries, unofficial, unregistered, but frequent. "No one has ever confirmed that," Clara said, "but no one has ever denied it either." That raised a new possibility. The mansion was not only inhabited, it could be being refueled by someone from the city itself. In the following days, Daniel began to observe patterns of movement in the areas near the road to the mansion. Few vehicles passed by, but some were frequent, always at night, always without visible license plates, and always at similar times. Meanwhile, Marcus remained cautious, but increasingly involved. Despite his initial resistance, something about Daniel's presence seemed to rekindle an old need to understand what had really happened. But there was something none of them could ignore. They were being watched. Not directly, but subtle. Lingering gazes on the street, movements interrupted as they approached, people changing direction for no apparent reason. And then, one night, it stopped being just an impression. Daniel found something on the door of the room where he was staying, an envelope, no sender. Inside, just one photograph. Granulated, dark, but unmistakable. It was him, standing before the gates of the mansion. The photo had been thrown inside. The envelope was still in Daniel's hands when he slowly closed the door. The image left no doubt. Someone inside Holloway Manor not only saw him, but precisely recorded his presence. The angle of the photo indicated proximity. It wasn't a distant camera. It was someone strategically positioned, observing every movement from the outside. That changed everything. Until then, Daniel had been working with hypotheses. Now there was concrete confirmation. The mansion was active, and its occupants were paying attention. He placed the photograph on the table and took other photos with his cell phone, analyzing magnified details. The graininess made identification difficult, but one element caught his attention, a slight shadow reflected in the lower corner of the image. A silhouette, someone holding the camera. But the strangest thing was the posture. He didn't seem like someone in hiding. He looked like someone waiting to be seen. The following morning, Daniel went looking for Marcus. Without further ado, he placed the photograph on the bar table. Marcus hesitated for a few seconds before reacting. His eyes scanned the image intently, and for the first time, his expression shifted from caution to something closer to genuine unease. "They didn't used to do that," he said quietly. "They used to?" Daniel insisted. Marcus took a deep breath before answering. Before, no one had proof that anyone was inside, only suspicions, only stories. But this here, he pointed to the photo, this is a warning. Daniel kept his gaze steady, or an invitation. Marcus shook his head, denying it. There is no invitation coming from that place. But despite the resistance, Marcus decided to help. He revealed something he had never officially told anyone before. During the investigation, which was interrupted years ago, one of the agents reported hearing voices inside the property. Not screams, not cries for help, conversations, multiple, as if several people were living there. But when the team tried to advance beyond the gates, they received a direct order to retreat. No explanation, no justification, "And you accepted that?" Daniel asked. Marcus hesitated. "No, I came back later." The silence that followed was heavy. "And what did you find?" Marcus did not respond immediately. "Nothing and everything." That wasn't helping. But Daniel realized it wasn't simple fear. It was something deeper, something Marcus still couldn't put into words. Meanwhile, Clara was going along a different path. She began analyzing the city's supply records, bulk purchases, non-standard deliveries, unusual financial transactions, and she found something relevant. Local businesses were reporting frequent inventory losses, without any formal complaints. Food, basic equipment, fuel, nothing that stood out on its own. But together, they formed a clear pattern. Someone was embezzling funds, and doing it quietly. "This isn't improvisation," Clara said, showing the data to Daniel. "It's organization." That raised a new layer of conflict. If the mansion was being kept active for so long, then there was outside collaboration. It wasn't just an isolated mystery, it was a system. And systems have participants. That same night, Daniel decided to return to the road by the mansion. But this time, he wasn't alone. Marcus insisted on going with him. The weather was different. The wind was stronger, the sky completely overcast, with no sign of the moon. The darkness seemed denser than usual, as if it were absorbing any attempt at visibility. They parked the car a safe distance away and continued on foot. Each step seemed higher than it should have been, every sound amplified. When they finally arrived at the gates, something immediately caught their attention. The padlock was no longer in the same place, still in jail, but out of place. It was as if it had been opened and closed again. Marcus approached first, examining it closely. It wasn't like this before. Daniel had already noticed another detail, the footprints, most recent, more numerous. And this time, it wasn't just one person. There were different brands, varied sizes, different directions. That confirmed what had previously been just theory. There were more people inside. Suddenly, a sound, this time more clearly. Steps, coming from inside the property, boards, regulars. Marcus and Daniel froze. The footsteps stopped, absolute silence. And then a light came on inside the mansion. A single window on the upper floor, yellowish, weak, but enough to reveal movement. A shadow flashed across the glass, then another one and another one. It wasn't a person. There were several. Daniel felt his heart race, but he didn't back down. On the contrary, he took a step forward. That's when something unexpected happened. The padlock fell off, with a dry sound against the floor. Neither of them had touched him. The gate opened slowly, its metallic creaking echoing in the night. Marcus grabbed Daniel's arm. This is not normal. But Daniel already knew that. What he didn't know was whether that was an opportunity or a trap. On the other side of the gates, the darkness seemed even deeper, denser, as if she were alive, and for the first time, the decision wasn't just to investigate, it was time to go in. The gate was still swaying slowly when Daniel and Marcus stood motionless for a few seconds, staring into the darkness beyond the walls. The metallic creaking seemed to echo more than it should, as if the sound were being absorbed and then returned. But neither of them backed down. Without exchanging a word, they went through the gate. The air on the other side was different, colder, heavier. There was a subtle smell, difficult to identify, something between rust, dampness, and decaying organic matter. It wasn't strong enough to cause immediate revulsion, but enough to keep the senses constantly on alert. The road to the mansion was longer than it appeared from the outside. The vegetation grew irregularly, as if it had never been completely abandoned, but also never cared for. There were signs of passage, broken branches, faint trails, indicating frequent, albeit careful, use. "They don't want to be seen," Marcus murmured. Daniel was watching everything. Nothing there was random. Every detail indicated control, and that made everything more disturbing. As they approached the main structure, the mansion's sheer size was fully revealed. It was larger than any ordinary house, with side wings partially hidden by the darkness and windows that seemed to multiply as the eye tried to take in its expanse. But what was most striking was the absence of sound. No insects. No animals. Nothing. As if even nature avoided that place. Before they could proceed to the main entrance, a sideways movement caught Daniel's attention. Something. To the left. He gestured to Marcus and approached slowly, veering away from the mansion's entrance. There, partially hidden by dense bushes, was a smaller structure, a kind of annex. The door was ajar. Without hesitation, Daniel pushed slowly. The interior was dark but tidy. Too much. Shelves neatly aligned, boxes labeled, equipment stacked with precision. It wasn't an abandoned space, it was a support point. And then the confirmation: groceries, bottled water, medications, tools. Everything is recent. "This is being restocked regularly," said Daniel, examining the labels. Marcus remained silent, but his expression already indicated what he was thinking. That wasn't improvised survival. It was a continuous operation. Meanwhile, another piece of the story was beginning to fall into place elsewhere. Clara. Alone in her house, she cross-referenced old documents with current records. Her investigation progressed in parallel, and what she found that night completely changed the scenario. A name. Repeated numerous times in historical documents related to the city, and discreetly present in modern records of local businesses: Edward Holloway. Officially, the last known member of the family had been declared missing decades ago. But Clara found something strange. Recent transactions linked to an old account associated with the family name. Active, regulars, discreet. "That's not possible," she murmured to herself. But the data didn't lie. Someone was using that name, and doing this for years. Back at the property, Daniel and Marcus emerged from the annex with more questions than answers. But something changed. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was no longer subtle. She was straightforward, heavy. As if their every move was being closely watched. It was then that a sound broke the silence. A door slamming shut, coming from the main mansion. They both turned around immediately. The front door, which had previously only been ajar, was now wide open, and the interior light was on. Yellowish, weak, but enough to reveal the interior. A long corridor. It's empty. Or at least, it seemed that way. Marcus took a deep breath. That's wrong. But Daniel was already moving forward. Each step toward the entrance increased the tension. The floor creaked beneath their feet, and the air seemed heavier with every meter traveled. When they crossed the threshold, the feeling was immediate. The interior of the mansion was different from the exterior, much more. There was no accumulated dust as expected. There were no signs of actual abandonment. There was a use for it, recent, constant. The corridor stretched ahead, with doors closed on both sides. Some bore marks, scratches. Others makeshift reinforcements, and then a sound, this time unmistakable, a whisper, not clear words, but voices, more than one, coming from somewhere deeper inside the house. Marcus grabbed Daniel's arm again. "Are you listening to this?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Try." And they weren't echoes, they were people. But something was wrong. The tone of the voices, it didn't seem like a normal conversation. It was controlled, too low, as if they were trying not to be heard, or as if they knew they were being. Suddenly, one of the doors in the hallway moved, slowly, opening up a few centimeters. The darkness inside contrasted sharply with the light in the hallway. And then, one eye, observing, I did. Without blinking. Daniel stepped forward. The door slammed shut. The sound echoed throughout the entire house. And immediately, the voices have ceased. Absolute silence. But it wasn't empty. It was expected. As if something had been triggered. As if their presence had crossed a line. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside the house, Something has changed, and at that moment it became clear. They weren't just investigating the mansion. They had entered a living system, and now they were part of it. The silence that filled the mansion after the door closed was unnatural. He was organized, controlled. As if every sound had been deliberately cut off, Daniel remained motionless for a few seconds, trying to catch any new noise. Nothing. No footsteps, no whispers, only the distant sound of the wind hitting against the old structure of the house. But something had changed. They were no longer observers. Now, intruders had been detected. Marcus was the first to react. "That's over," he said, in a firm but low tone. "We're leaving now." But Daniel did not move. His eyes were fixed on the corridor ahead. "No. Now is exactly when we continue." Marcus gripped his arm tighter this time. "You don't understand. This isn't just a bunch of people hiding. Something's wrong here." Daniel turned his face slowly. "I know." And that was precisely why he wouldn't back down. Without waiting for an answer, he walked down the hallway. Marcus hesitated, but ended up following. As they walked, they began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. Marks on the floor, traces, not ordinary dirt, but something being dragged along, heavy, regular. As if something had been moved repeatedly along that same path. The corridor ended in a staircase that led to the upper floor, exactly where the light had been seen earlier. But before they could go up, a sound came from below, a dry impact. They both turned around immediately. Behind them, the front door had closed, with force. Marcus ran towards it, trying to open it. Locked, without any visible mechanism. "There's no lock here," he said, pressing hard, but he wouldn't give in. Daniel watched for a few seconds. There were no chains, there was no padlock, nothing physical is preventing the opening. And yet, it wouldn't open. That's when the lights flickered. Once, two, and then they stabilized, but something had changed. The hallway looked different, longer, narrower. The doors on the sides, which had previously been aligned, now seemed out of place. "Are you seeing this?" Marcus asked, his voice lower. Daniel did not answer, because he was watching. But it didn't make sense. Before they could react, a sound began to emerge. Steps coming from upstairs, boards coordinated, more than one person going down. Marcus instinctively recoiled. "We need to hide." But there was no time. The footsteps were drawing closer, and then they stopped, right at the top of the stairs. A shadow appeared on the wall, then another one, and one more. And then the first figure appeared, a man, skinny, pale, deep-set but attentive eyes. He didn't seem surprised. He seemed conscious. Behind him, other people began to appear. Men, women, they all had the same strangely controlled appearance. None of them were making progress. None of them spoke. They were just watching. Daniel felt something he didn't expect. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. Something about that behavior had made sense. But before she could process it, the man in front finally spoke. "You took too long." The phrase echoed down the hallway, direct, without emotion. Daniel frowned. "More. What?" The man tilted his head slightly. "We knew someone was coming, they always do." Marcus stepped forward. "Who are you?" But the man completely ignored the question. His eyes were fixed only on Daniel. "The difference is that you came in." The silence that followed was heavy. Then the man took a step forward, and something became clear. They were not armed. They weren't making any physical threats. But also, they weren't trying to stop anything. "This isn't what you think," he continued. "It never was." Daniel kept his gaze steady. "Then explain." The man took a deep breath. And then he said something that changed everything. "We're not trapped here." A pause. "We are being supported." Marcus reacted immediately. "By whom?" But there was no answer, because at that exact moment a much louder sound echoed throughout the entire house. A loud bang, coming from somewhere deep within the structure. The ground trembled slightly, the lights flickered again, and for the first time, the faces of the people in front changed. It wasn't fear, it was preparation, as if that were to be expected, as if it were part of something bigger. The man looked at Daniel again. "Now you'll understand." Before anyone could react, all the lights went out. Total darkness, and then a new sound, much closer. Breathing, heavy, irregular, coming from somewhere, inside the hallway itself, but not from where those people were, from somewhere else. Closer, very close. And at that moment, Daniel realized those people were not a mystery. They were a part of him, and the real problem, it hadn't been revealed yet. Darkness took over everything. For a few seconds, there was no reference point, no space, no direction, no time. Only the sound of heavy, irregular breathing. Too close. Marcus instinctively recoiled, bumping into one of the corridor walls. "Daniel!" Her voice came out low and tense. "There's something here." Daniel did not respond immediately. He was trying to locate the sound. It wasn't coming from the stairs. It didn't come from the people who were there seconds before. It was coming from inside the house, as if the walls themselves were breathing. Then, a snap. The lights came back on, but not like before. Now they were weaker, intermittent, as if they were being fed by something unstable, and the hallway was empty. Completely empty. The people who were at the top of the stairs had disappeared. "I am here." No movement perceived, nothing. Marcus looked around in disbelief. They were here. Daniel nodded slowly. "I know." But something was even more disturbing. The doors. They were open now, all. Once closed, aligned, almost identical, now wide open, revealing distinct interiors, and none of them seemed ordinary. Daniel approached the first one. A simple room, bed, table, personal belongings, but everything too organized, no signs of immediate use, as if it were being kept for someone. He moved on to the next one, and then the difference. The environment was similar but there were marks, scratches on the walls, deep risks, and something on the ground, dark spots, old. Marcus avoided looking for too long. This isn't normal. Daniel already knew that, but the pattern was beginning to emerge. Each room was different. Some are organized, others deteriorated, as if they represented stages, states, or behaviors. Before they could move any further, a new sound emerged. This time, further away, a drag, heavy. This is it, coming from one of the rooms furthest back. Marcus looked at Daniel. "We shouldn't be pursuing this." But Daniel was already moving. Each step increased the tension. The sound continued, constant, irregular rhythm, as if something were being pulled or trying to move. When they reached the door where the sound was coming from, Daniel paused for a second. He took a deep breath, and he pushed. What was inside was not a room. It was a larger room. No windows, with dim lighting coming from a single lamp hanging from the ceiling, and in the center a chair, stuck to the ground, with straps, several, some loose, others torn. Marcus froze immediately. "This here is containment." Daniel approached slowly. Deep marks on the floor around the chair indicated resistance, intense movement, desperate. And then, the most disturbing detail, on the wall in front of the chair, there were words, written repeatedly, with force, urgently. "He observes, he chooses, he doesn't leave." The sentences overlapped as if different people had written them over time, or the same person at different times. Marcus took a step back. These aren't normal people, but Daniel was no longer looking at the wall. His focus had shifted. To the ground there was a track, subtle, almost imperceptible, as if something heavy were regularly being moved from there, out of the room. And then the sound returned, closer, coming from the hallway. They both turned around immediately. The dragging, stronger now, closer, and then something appeared in the doorway of the room. A figure, curved, moving erratically, dragging one leg, head down, but the body, the human body. Marcus froze. My God! The figure slowly raised its face. Their eyes were open, but they weren't focused. The expression, empty, as if there was no consciousness left there. But that wasn't the most disturbing thing. It was the behavior. He did not react to their presence. He didn't attack. He didn't speak. It just moved, as if it were following a pattern, a routine. Daniel watched with extreme attention. He is not lost. Marcus looked at him, confused. What? He is conditioned. The word echoed heavily in the room. Before they could react, the figure stopped completely. Property. And then he turned his head slowly, in the opposite direction, as if responding to something they couldn't see or listen. And immediately it began to move again, leaving the room, following the corridor, without looking back, without hesitation. Marcus took a deep breath, trying to process it. This isn't just people being kept. Daniel finally answered, "No." His eyes were fixed on the door. "This is control." At that moment, all the pieces began to fall into place. People, the rooms, the containment room, behavior. Nothing was random, nothing was abandonment. It was a system, but not a common system. Something there was shaping human behavior on an ongoing basis, silent, it's efficient. And then a new sound echoed through the house, this time loud, an alarm, low but steady, coming from somewhere deeper within the structure. The lights flickered again, and this time they didn't go back to normal. They turned red, fracas, pulsating. Marcus looked at Daniel. "We need to get out of here. Now." But Daniel did not move, because he finally understood. They hadn't activated something by accident. They had been brought there. Every step, every door opened, every sound. It was all part of a process. And now they had advanced to the next phase. The red light pulsed through the mansion's corridors, transforming everything into an even more oppressive scene. Every wall, every open door, every mark on the floor seemed to come alive under that unstable lighting. But something inside Daniel had changed. Up until that point, he was reacting. Now, he started to act. "We can't leave yet," he said firmly. Marcus turned around immediately. "Have you gone mad? This is no ordinary investigation." Daniel stared at him with a calmness that hadn't been present before. "Exactly, and that's why nobody has ever been able to solve it." Marcus hesitated. There was something different in Daniel's gaze. It wasn't stubbornness, it was understanding. "Everything here follows a pattern," Daniel continued. "The people, the rooms, the movements. Even us." "Us?" Marcus frowned. Daniel nodded. "Did you realize? We didn't choose the path. The house led us there. The silence that followed was uncomfortable because it made sense. The doors that opened, the sounds that emerged at the exact moment, the figure that appeared and disappeared. Nothing there was random." "So what's the next step?" Marcus asked, now in a lower voice. Daniel took a deep breath, looking around. "We stop following and start breaking the pattern." It was risky, but it was the only option. Without waiting any longer, Daniel made a decision unlike any he had made before. Instead of proceeding down the main corridor from where the sounds were coming, he turned in the opposite direction, a darker path, narrower, no clear signs of recent use. Marcus realized it immediately. This wasn't the way it used to be. "Exactly," replied Daniel. They proceeded cautiously. The difference was immediate. The atmosphere there didn't seem prepared. There was no constant light. There were no strategically placed open doors. There was genuine neglect, accumulated dust, forgotten objects, and for the first time since they entered the mansion, complete silence. Daniel paused for a moment. This is not part of the control. Marcus looked around. Or it was abandoned, or it was discarded. The word hung in the air. As they progressed, they began to encounter different elements, old papers scattered around, broken equipment, And then, records. Daniel found a partially open folder on an overturned table. Documents, reports, technical notes. He began to flip through it quickly. Keywords kept appearing repeatedly. Behavior, repetition, stimulus response, breaking the pattern. Marcus approached. "This is an experiment," Daniel nodded slowly. "Not only that, it's continuous." They continued advancing, and then they found what appeared to be the central point of that abandoned area. A larger room, with old but sophisticated equipment. Broken monitors, cables scattered everywhere, and an entire wall covered in diagrams, flows, arrows, cycles, like a map, but not from the house, of the people, precisely mapped behavioral patterns, routines, reactions, deviations, and then, at the center of it all, a name repeated, Edward Holloway. Marcus took a step back. Is he behind this? Daniel analyzed everything carefully. Or at least that's how it started. That's when they realized something even more important. A highlighted, handwritten note, different from the rest. "External subjects present greater resistance," Marcus read in a low voice. "External subjects, that's us." Daniel nodded. "And that explains why we are still conscious." That completely changed the perspective. They weren't being controlled in the same way, not yet. But they were inside the system, and that meant there was limited time before they too were assimilated into the standard. "So what's the plan?" Marcus asked, now more focused. Daniel looked at the map on the wall, then to the corridor they came through, and then he replied, "We'll find the center of it all." Marcus hesitated. "And then what?" Daniel answered without looking away. "We're going to break down." For the first time since they entered the mansion, Marcus didn't ask a question, because now it was no longer about investigating. It was about coming out with the truth. And perhaps to prevent it from continuing. But before they could move, a different sound echoed through the room. It wasn't coming from the main corridors, not even from the system. It was coming from there, from the room itself. One click, low but mechanical. Daniel immediately looked at the equipment. One of the monitors had turned on. The screen was shaking, full of interference, but slowly an image began to form. Granulated, black and white, a room, a chair, the same one they had seen before, and in it someone is sitting down, property, head down. Marcus approached. "Who is that?" Daniel did not answer, because the image kept adjusting, clearing up, defining. And then the face became visible. It was him, Daniel, sitting in the chair, property, no reaction, expressionless, as if it were already part of the system. The silence that followed was absolute, and for the first time since entering the mansion, Daniel hesitated. The image flickered on the screen, but there was no doubt. It was Daniel, sitting in the chair, property, no reaction. Marcus took a step back, as if this were more than disturbing, as if it were impossible. This doesn't make sense." But Daniel did not answer. His eyes were fixed on the screen, analyzing, processing, and slowly understanding. "It's not the future," he said in a low voice. Marcus looked at him. "How can you be so sure of that?" Daniel pointed to the screen. "Look at the details." Marcus approached again, straining his gaze. The image was unstable, but there were differences. The marks on the wall, the position of the chair, the scratches on the floor. They were not identical to what they had seen before. And then Daniel added, "This has already happened." The silence that followed was even heavier. "With someone else," Marcus said, almost in a whisper. Daniel nodded. "And the system is showing us that." "Why?" Daniel took a few seconds to answer. "Because we're getting too close. That was not a direct threat, it was a warning, or perhaps an attempt at adaptation, as if the system were testing new forms of control. Before they could delve deeper, the screen changed. The image disappeared for a moment, and then he returned, but not with the room. Now it was a map, different from what was on the wall. More details, deeper, with moving markings, points that moved slowly. "This is the house," said Marcus. Daniel nodded. "And these points, it's the people." They watched in silence. The points followed predictable patterns, repetitive movements, cycles, routines. But there was something different. 2 points did not follow the pattern. They moved erratically. No repetition, no cycle. "It's us," said Marcus. Daniel confirmed it. "And that means the system still hasn't managed to integrate us." But then something changed. A third point appeared, property in its early stages. Then it started to move. But not like the others. His movement was direct. Aim, no repetition, going in their direction. Silence returned. "This isn't normal," Marcus said. Daniel agreed. "No." That's the answer. They were no longer just inside the system. Now, the system was reacting. Without wasting any time, Daniel began to analyze the map more carefully. There were highlighted areas, sectors. And that's a central point. Bigger. I did. Unlike all the others. "There," he said. Marcus followed the gaze. "What's over there?" Daniel replied with conviction. "The control." There was no longer any doubt. If they wanted to leave, if they wanted to understand, if they wanted to stop it, that was where they needed to go. But there was a problem. The third point. It kept getting closer, faster now. Marcus looked around. "We won't be able to get there before then." Daniel thought quickly, and then he made another decision. "We don't run." Marcus was confused. "What?" "We attract." The idea seemed absurd. But it made sense within the logic he had identified. If this works by default, then we create a new one. Without waiting for a response, Daniel picked up one of the metal objects from the floor and threw it forcefully against a distant wall. The sound echoed loudly. Strong. Unlike anything that had happened before, the map reacted immediately. The point that was heading towards them changed trajectory. Now heading towards the sound. Marcus's eyes widened. It worked. Daniel was already moving. Now! They left the room quickly, following the path indicated on the map. But the atmosphere was no longer the same. The lights were flickering more frequently. The sound started to reappear, distant, but constant. It was as if the house were reorganizing itself, as if he were trying to adapt. Each corridor seemed narrower, each turn more confusing. But Daniel remained focused. He was no longer reacting to his surroundings. I was anticipating it. Guiding, and for the first time the mansion seemed to lose control over them. But that wouldn't last, because as they moved forward, a new sound began to emerge, not in steps, not to be dragged, but something more mechanical, heavier, coming from the central point. And then, as they turned down the last corridor before their destination, they saw it. A different kind of door, metallic, reinforced, with deep scars all around, as if something had tried to get out. Repeatedly. Daniel stopped in front of her, controlled breathing. Stare. "It's here." Marcus looked back for a moment. The distant sound was returning, faster, closer. "We don't have much time." Daniel placed his hand on the door. Free, heavy, real, unlike anything they had played before. And then he said, almost in a whisper, "Whatever this is, it ends here." He pushed. The door began to open, slowly, revealing only darkness, but not ordinary darkness, one that seemed to be watching back. The metal door swung open completely with a deep dragging sound that echoed throughout the mansion. On the other side, there was no corridor, not even a regular classroom. It was a large space, deep, industrial, unlike anything they had ever seen before. The lighting was minimal, coming from lights embedded in the floor and walls, creating elongated shadows that moved as Daniel and Marcus advanced. And at the center of it all, there was a structure. It wasn't just a machine, not just one room. It was a combination of both. An installation, thick cables connected to walls and ceiling, metal panels showing signs of constant use, monitors scattered around, some working, others off, and at the core, a chair. but not like the previous one. This one was bigger, more complex, surrounded by equipment, sensors, mechanical arms retracted, as if it were ready to be used at any moment. Marcus stopped immediately. This here is the center. Daniel did not answer, because his eyes were fixed on something behind the structure, a figure standing, property, observing. As they moved within a few steps, the figure stepped toward the light. A man, undefined age, appearance preserved too well. But the eyes held something different, full awareness, absolute control. "Edward Holloway," said Daniel confidently. The man tilted his head slightly. "It took longer than I expected." Marcus didn't hide his reaction. "You should be dead." Edward flashed something close to a smile. "Technically, I am." The silence that followed was heavy. Daniel took another step forward. "What is all this about?" Edward looked around, as if he were observing his own creation. "Evolution." The answer was simple, direct. "It's disturbing. Human beings are flawed," he continued. "Unpredictable, unstable. They waste potential." He pointed to the monitors around him. "Here, I'll eliminate that." Marcus clenched his fists. "You are controlling people." Edward corrected him calmly. "I'm making adjustments." Daniel kept his gaze steady. "You are erasing who they are." Edward took a few steps closer. "No, I'm removing what's preventing them from working properly." The tone wasn't one of madness. It was a matter of conviction. This made everything worse. "And what about the disappearances?" Daniel insisted. "Recruitment. Forced." Edward did not answer directly. "Necessary." Silence returned. But this time, it's filled with real tension. Marcus looked around. "This will not continue." Edward turned his eyes to him. "It has been going on for decades." And then he added, "And you didn't realize it." The phrase resonated more strongly than any threat, because it was true. The city knew. The city provided food. The city was part of it. Daniel took another step. "And now?" Edward looked directly at him. "Now it's your decision." He made a subtle gesture toward the center chair. "You've already understood the pattern. You've resisted more than any other external factor." A pause. "That makes you useful." Marcus reacted immediately. "Don't listen to him." But Edward continued. "You can leave now. Silence. Or you can stay and help improve it." Daniel did not answer. His eyes were now on the machine. "We're done. We monitors. In the data." And then he saw a mistake. Small, almost imperceptible, but it's real. The cycles, the standards, they had an overload point, a limit, and that machine depended on it. Edward noticed the change in Daniel's gaze. "You understood, didn't you?" Daniel finally answered. "I understood." And then he made his decision. Without warning, without hesitation, he ran straight to the structure. Marcus reacted a second later. "Daniel!" Edward did not try to stop him immediately, but his gaze changed. For the first time, there was an emergency. Daniel reached the center panel. His eyes scanned the controls quickly. He didn't need to understand everything, just enough. The standard, repetition, the limit. And then he found it, a point of saturation. Without wasting any time, he pulled one of the main cables. The system reacted immediately. Alarms, flashing lights, the sound of the structure shifting. Edward has now moved forward, fast. "You don't know what you're doing." But Daniel didn't stop. He pulled another cable, and another. The system partially collapsed. The monitors started malfunctioning. The movement points disappeared. Marcus ran to help. "What do I do?" Anything that's connected, Daesh breaks. They started destroying whatever they could. Cables being ripped out, panels being hit. The structure is vibrating. Edward tried to intervene, but it was too late. The system depended on continuity, and they were breaking it. Then something happened. The lights went out completely. For a second, silence, and then a sound. Unlike anything that had come before. Shouting, coming from all over the mansion, not from pain, but about waking up. It was as if dozens of people were waking up at the same time. Edward stopped. Property. His eyes scanned the space around him. For the first time, he lost control. Daniel was breathing heavily. The system in front of you is collapsing. And then he said, "He finished." Edward looked at him, and slowly, she smiled, but not out of satisfaction. Something different. No. A pause. Now it has begun. Before they could react, the central structure emitted one last pulse of energy, strong, unstable, and then it exploded in a silent shockwave. Darkness has returned, but this time, definitive. When consciousness returned, there was no immediate sound. The absence of noise was almost deafening. Daniel slowly opened his eyes, feeling his body heavy, as if every muscle had been drained of energy. The air was still there, cold, dense, but something had changed. The pressure had disappeared. He struggled to his feet, supporting himself on what remained of the surrounding structure. The room where the system's core used to be was now just a partially destroyed space. Loose cables, broken panels, impact marks everywhere. Nothing is working, nothing active. Marcus was a few meters ahead, also getting up, visibly disoriented. "You are," he began, but stopped when he realized the obvious answer. Daniel nodded. "I am." But neither of them spoke about what really mattered at that moment, the system. They looked around again. Absolute silence. No flashing lights. No active monitors, without patterns. That which controlled everything had stopped, or at least it seemed to have stopped. "And him?" Marcus finally asked. Daniel understood immediately. Edward Holloway. They searched, but there was no signal, no body, no direct evidence, as if he had never been there. But that brought no relief. On the contrary, it brought doubt. Without wasting any more time, they left the room. The way back through the mansion was completely different. The doors remained open, but now they revealed something new. Movement. People, but not like before. Now, aware, confused. Some sat on the floor, looking around as if waking from a dream that had gone on for too long. Others walked slowly, touching walls and objects, trying to understand where they were. No aggression, no pattern, just disorientation. "They are back," Marcus said quietly. Daniel watched everything attentively. Not all of them. Marcus understood. Some were still motionless, seated, stopped, eyes open, but empty, as if something had been interrupted in the middle of the process, as if there was no turning back for them. The reality was not simple. It never was. As they made their way towards the exit, more people appeared in the corridors. Some were crying, others just watched in silence, as if they were still trying to reconnect with something that had been lost. And then, as they passed through the gate again, the outside world seemed different. The air was lighter, the sound of the wind natural, as if that property were isolated not only physically, but from everything around it. In the days that followed, the city of Blackridge changed. Not immediately, but inevitable. The authorities were finally involved. Official investigations have begun. The mansion was isolated, and this time there was no silence. But there were no complete answers either. Many of those rescued were unable to explain what they had experienced. Some remembered nothing. Others remembered too much. Fragmented accounts began to emerge, forced routines, repetitive commands, a constant feeling of being watched. But there was no concrete explanation of how it all worked, and most importantly, no definitive proof against Edward Holloway. Documents were found, equipment analyzed, but the person directly responsible never located. Daniel stayed in the city longer than he had planned, not as a journalist, but like someone trying to understand what had really happened, because something still didn't add up. The system had been destroyed, but his logic, no. She still existed, in the records, based on the identified patterns, and perhaps elsewhere. Before leaving, Daniel returned one last time to the road by the mansion. The gates were now open. No chains, no padlock. No apparent mystery, but he knew. What was happening inside was not just an isolated event, it was a test. That control doesn't require brute force, just time, standard, and repetition. He took one last photo, not from the mansion, but the road was empty, because now I understood. The real danger was never what was hidden behind the walls, but what managed to exist there without anyone really stopping it. And as he walked away, one last feeling lingered. Not out of fear. But there's no doubt about it, because if it worked once, there was no guarantee that it wouldn't be working again, elsewhere, in another way, waiting. Months later, Holloway Manor was no longer mentioned with the same frequency. The city moved on, or at least, he tried. The gates remained open, but no one approached unnecessarily. The property, now officially isolated, remained silent, no longer threatening, but still laden with something difficult to explain. In an office some distance away, Daniel was reviewing newly received files. Among incomplete reports and fragmented documents, one detail caught his attention: a record, recent, from another city, another state, with similar descriptions. He remained silent for a few seconds, then he opened the attached image. Granulated, dark, more family-oriented, an iron gate, high walls, and in the bottom corner of the photo, a camera, slightly tilted, pointed directly at the observer. And now I ask you a question. If you were in Daniel's place, would you have gone through those gates, or would he have ignored the signs, like everyone else had done for years? Stories like this make us reflect on something unsettling. How many truths are hidden right before our eyes, disguised as silence, routine, or collective fear? If this story has captivated you this far, leave a comment telling me what you would do in this situation. I'd love to hear your opinion. And if you enjoy dark mysteries, realistic stories, and mind-bending narratives, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next story might be even more disturbing.